Our session now is called Matthew Highlights, Roman numeral 1. Every word of God is tested. It says in the Proverbs, He is a shield to all those who take refuge in Him. So to talk about highlights in Matthew is kind of sacrilegious because every word of God is a highlight. So think of highlights of highlights. If you know Matthew, probably the first thing you think about in Matthew is the Sermon on the Mount. So we want to spend some time looking at the Sermon on the Mount. And it's in the syllabus on page 54. It begins, and you can look at your own Bible as well. In the syllabus, again, it's the NLT that's cited. But I thought, how could we survey the Sermon on the Mount and sort of get at important aspects of it, knowing that we've only got 20 minutes to do that. And I boiled it down to just a few observations, and I know you have read it for this class, and a lot of you have lived with it for decades, heard it preached, maybe taught it yourself. I will point out first that Christ defies what most people think about God and being right with Him. There's a lot of triumphalism in churches. And even things that really are pretty sobering and maybe a little obnoxious. They get turned around so, oh yeah, that's really nice. Blessed are those who mourn. I mean, have you had a loved one die recently? I have. And when grief steamrolls you, there's nothing blessed about grief. Now, you may know intellectually there's a blessing here, but especially when you can't eat, when you can't sleep, when grief grabs you and it's like it shocks you sometimes because you didn't know you cared that much or you didn't know that person had such a hold on you. There are things that are bigger than we are in the world, and grief is one of them, and yet Jesus says, blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who are poor. Blessed are those who are meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. Blessed are those who are merciful. That sounds, well, what's bad about that? In a lot of social settings, you don't want to be a person that has to show mercy. You want to be a person who can just do whatever you want to do, and you're not worried about mercy because you're in power. That's the kind of society the Roman Empire was. Remember, Jesus told the Jewish authorities, go and learn the weightier things of the law. One of them was mercy. They were tithing mint and cumin, but they weren't in tune with the really important things like mercy. In mercy, in a sense, you're stooping to overlook something that if you really are full of righteousness, you don't overlook. Blessed are the pure in heart. You get pure in heart by recognizing you need help from God. Create in me a pure heart, a clean heart, O God. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Blessed are those who people mock and persecute and tell lies about, so on and so forth. The Sermon on the Mount starts out destabilizing our conceptions. Jesus basically it's a shot across the bow. Whatever you think about God and being right with God, I'm going to turn it upside down, starting now. And it kind of goes downhill from there in terms of just assuring people that, hey, you're pretty good, but let me help you be even better. Or here's something that will really make your life ideal and comfortable, and you'll be wealthy, and you'll be so happy and so full of joy. A lot of these things that he associates with God's blessedness are very mixed blessings, and when you get to the part about persecution and mockery and so on and so forth, there's just no way to put a good face on that. And nobody in their right mind wishes for these things. I've spent a fair bit of time in Muslim Africa and teaching people, pastors, Christian workers, many of whom have been arrested and many of whom have been tortured. And in dealing with these folks, and then over the years, I was there for 13 years, twice a year, before we got shut down by a government. I recall the book that I read about the military, and I think it was called Fight or Flight. And it was a book about fighting, about combat, and about fear. A lot of it was like military psychology and just human psychology. But talking about how resilient some people are in warfare, how valiant they can be. But really the book was studying battle fatigue, or what we now call post-traumatic stress. It wasn't even called, the book was probably back from the 70s or 80s. They weren't calling it that quite yet like they do now. But it was saying everybody, no matter how brave, you've got so many sort of valiant outbursts, but at some point, you're done. And what you hope is that the war ends before you use up all of your valiant capabilities. And I was reminded of that with people who've been arrested and been tortured. And none of them showcased what they had been through or what had happened to them. And when they would tell their stories, it was never in a public setting. It was always much more private. And as they told it, they would kind of be reliving it. And so it was very painful for them. But none of them would ever have wanted to do it again, even though as ministers of the gospel in a Sharia law country, they all knew at any time they could get the knock on the door. Or somebody could fall in alongside of them on the street, and it could be security, and they would have to go. And they would be back in, they called them ghost houses. Security detention centers where they would be tortured. Blessed are you when you're persecuted. Really? When you're in a setting, and Jesus was in a setting where this was going to become pretty much a norm. You see in the early chapters of Acts how they were hounded by the legal authorities. And there was a lot of persecution in the early church. Jesus said there's a great blessing that attaches to what the cost of discipleship is going to be for you. And this is very different from health and wealth type thinking, or even less theologically skewed understandings that associate Jesus and belief in Jesus just with human well-being and health and happiness and getting your problem solved and having a good marriage and all that. All these blessings that God can grant. He can grant all these things, and he does. And yet that's not really the core of what Jesus came to found in the way of a society. People who saw in God, or saw in him, a means to better themselves. We call that a theology of glory. And Jesus came with a theology that was much more a theology of the cross. Secondly, Christians have the responsibility to be God's billboards. That's another point that he makes, moving from this rather shocking affirmation that to follow him is to join the fraternity of the prophets who were persecuted and stoned. He moves from that to, you're the salt of the earth, and you're the light of the world. And, in your discomfiture, in your meekness, in your humility, in your poverty of spirit, in your being mocked and persecuted, precisely in that, you are, I say here, God's billboards. You permeate social settings you're in, and some of you know this, from your place of work, or maybe your family, maybe especially your extended family, there aren't very many Christians. Or maybe when you were in school, you can remember how there were just maybe one or two of you who were really serious about Christian faith, and what an oddball that made you. And this is what the Sermon on the Mount reminds Jesus' followers of. God is going to use you to reflect his light out into a world which is often not very receptive to God. The Sermon on the Mount also reminds us, among probably the 100 things we could say the Sermon on the Mount reminds us of, Jesus' followers are going to have to arrive at a righteousness that's greater than that of the scribes and Pharisees. And I think chapter 2 tries to say this of the Elwell Yarbrough book, but you can't say everything. The Pharisees, by and large, were highly admired in their social setting. Sometimes in churches, the Pharisees are seen as the bad guys. But the Pharisees were the best of the observant Jewish people in the time of Jesus. Moreover, the Pharisees agreed with Jesus, or I should say Jesus agreed with the Pharisees more closely and more extensively than he did with any of the Jewish groups. And in fact, in Matthew 23, just before Jesus pronounces some woes on the Pharisees and others, he says, the Pharisees have placed themselves in the seat of Moses. Everything they tell you, do. And at the core of Pharisaic outlook was everything we do should be done unto God and in obedience to God. And I think Jesus totally affirmed that. I think that's part of what we experience as Christians. More and more we want our lives to glorify God. And as we grow older, we find more and more ways that we can utilize our energies and utilize our spending and utilize our time for the sake of God and his service. And we get more and more sense of a gratification and communion with God through that. That's a Pharisaic idea. But Jesus also says in Matthew 23, but don't do as they do. Because the problem is they have all these grand theories and they load these guilt trips and regulations on people, but they don't touch them with their little finger. In other words, they're hypocrites. Now, that wasn't true of all the Pharisees. Joseph of Arimathea, for example. Nicodemus. These men became converts. And so they both had the Pharisaic theory, but they also had the questing for God, the desire for God. They made it possible for them to accept Jesus as the Son of God. But the Sermon on the Mount reminds us that there is an intimacy with God. There's a personal relationship to God that goes beyond orthopraxy. It goes beyond the exterior appearance of being Christian or being Jewish or being anything. And probably all of us know, maybe all of us have gone through times of our lives where our religion was a show. And maybe we didn't know it was a show. There are a lot of religious people that go to church and then they get saved. And they look back and they say, I was a deacon, or I was a Sunday school superintendent, or I was, and make the list of things that you did because you thought it was your duty, but your heart had not been opened up to God. And you weren't trusting in God for your redemption. You were gaming a denominational set of customs. You dress a certain way, you have a certain Bible translation, you show up at a certain time, you bring certain things to the potluck according to what's online with, A through M bring this, and you're part of the religious infrastructure, and you naturally think, well, that's what it's about. And there was a big religious infrastructure in Jesus' day, but the Sermon on the Mount comes and says, that group of people that are lunatic fringe followers of Yahweh. Pharisees didn't get paid for being Pharisees. They were tradesmen. They had to make their own living. But they were people recognized by the one or two rabbinic leaders who did make their living off of the contributions of their disciples. They were people recognized as people of good memory, good logical skills, good recall, blah, blah, blah. And they validated their Jewishness by making a contribution in society, like Paul was a tent maker. And so a combination of intellectual giftedness and then practical skill, and then they devoted themselves to learning the Torah and the traditions of the elders. And they were highly looked up to. Nobody could be saved if a Pharisee couldn't be saved. I mean, it wouldn't even have been questioned. Is a Pharisee saved? I mean, what a stupid question. Is the Pope saved? Ask a Catholic that. Stupid question. Is our pastor here at St. James, is he saved? Dumb question. But Jesus said, you're going to have to be a lot more righteous than a Pharisee. That went right over their head. I mean, that's like, what? But that's one of the many little sort of time bombs that the Sermon on the Mount, or we could say seditious seeds that it sows, that people didn't know how to compute. And later on we see what the righteousness that saves consists in. And it consists, of course, in Jesus' finished work. Number 4, Jesus came to renew the inner person. This is the miracle. This is the miracle of redemption, really, when you get down to it. Wherever you go in the world, there are religious people. Wherever you go in the world, there's religious zeal. It might be Buddhist, or it might be Muslim of various kinds, or it might be liberal post-Christian, or it might be Confucian traditionalist, it might be Marxist, it might be some African tribal thing. People are made in the image of God, and people live with religious fervor, and through all kinds of ways, and especially teaching on anger and adultery. Jesus said, if you're just angry with somebody, you've killed them. And if you just lust after a woman, you've slept with her. Those are very extreme statements. And he's being intentionally provocative to make people say, what are you talking about? And he knew, and there's been a lot written about rabbinic lust. And we know all about that from pastors. There was a well-known pastor back in the 90s. He was one of the major, I think actually he fell in the late 80s. No, he fell in the 90s. I'm getting my fallen pastors mixed up. But this particular guy, he was nationwide on airwaves, and he would go to a hotel room, and the story goes, just watch a prostitute. Now technically, he didn't have sex, but something? There's something very rotten there. That's what he said, all right? So you heard that story too. It was in the national news, so probably lots of it heard. What was that guy missing? He was missing that relationship with God through Christ is a transformation of the inner person. And when we don't have that, we don't have Christ. God changes people from the inside. And that's why rage and anger are such danger signs, because God can pour the oil of his wisdom and understanding and patience. That's one of the fruits of the Spirit. Love, joy. The fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience. It's right up there. Some of us are naysayers. I'm a big naysayer. I have the gift of criticism and pessimism. Second gift of the Spirit is joy. God can take gloomy people like myself and pessimistic people, and I have very good reasons to be pessimistic. He can replace that with the joy of hope in him. And that's, Jesus he's foreshadowing that in the Sermon on the Mount. He's saying, God takes lustful people, and as later on Paul will say to Timothy, treat older women as your mother and younger women as your sisters. A lot of men, and so you saw in the literature, I worked as a lumberjack, and that's not in a lot of the men I worked with. They're not going to treat a younger woman as their sister. A younger woman means just one thing. And so they're going to ogle and they're going to make obscene comments and so on and so forth. But Jesus says that can be transformed. And that's what he came to do. And the Sermon on the Mount is just the tip of the iceberg of the fact, and it's a glorious fact. It's really the only thing that makes our lives worth living, is that God can change us from the inside. Because if all he came to do was to change the time we go to worship, or the denomination we belong to, or the Bible translation that we use, or most commonly, the people we hate. A lot of religious groups are united by who they hate and what they denounce and what they don't do. We don't smoke, or we don't, whatever. Aren't we good? That's kind of the message. And that's not what Jesus came to do at all. He came to renew the inner person, and I've got the 3 verses in the Old Testament that talk about circumcision of the heart, just to underscore that this was not a new idea. It's just one that every generation has to discover. And faith communities lose contact. They lose contact with the reality of God's inner work in people's hearts. And in a group this size, we would have very interesting stories to tell about churches we had been in. Some of them really great churches with lots of mobilization in very grand and glorious ways, and other churches where we look back and we say, that was really a corrupt setting. There was stuff going on there that was awful. And yet, it was as much a church in the community as any other church. But people's hearts had not been transformed. And Moses says, circumcise the foreskin of your heart to the children of Israel. And he repeats that at the end of Deuteronomy. And, put that around 1500 BC. Jeremiah put that about 600 BC, 1,000 years later, 900 years later. Jeremiah is still saying, circumcise yourselves to the Lord, remove the foreskin of your hearts, O men of Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem. You can read it there for yourself. And in between that, put in David in Psalm 51, I record this tonight, create in me a clean heart, O God. This is an Old Testament notion, but it's one that Jesus reiterates in a very dramatic way by talking about anger and adultery, among other things. Jesus taught and modeled that prayer works. We'll get to that more in the book of Luke, but it's in Matthew, in a parallel in Luke, that we get the Lord's Prayer. He was a man of prayer. In the Gospels, especially in Matthew, Mark, Luke, he's always disappearing. And it's like, where is he? And he would be out by himself praying somewhere. You think, why does he have to pray so much if he's the Son of God? But that tells us something about our need as humans to commune with God the Father. And Jesus was the master, practicer, and modeler of prayer. And finally, Christ changes our dealings with everybody and gives us the intensity to make his will our priority. Let's close on that note by looking at 6, 11, and 12. Well, at least I think 12 is right. I don't think 11 is the right reference. I think I probably meant 10. To pray that God's kingdom would come, to pray that God's will would be done. And to do that in such a way, and Jesus did, I think, his point was, Father, not my will, but your will be done. That's not natural to humans. From the time babies are little, they want their will. And then we can sort of be trained in church etiquette and act like we want God's will to be done, but often it's a negotiating thing. We'll work for God's will on the assumption that over here we'll get some compensation for it. But the Sermon on the Mount reminds us of a stance toward God that it's habitual, it's our character. We live our lives for the realization of the will of God in the world. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy will be done. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And then we forgive people. We forgive people. Forgive us our sins as we have forgiven those who sin against us. I actually kind of like that translation. As we have forgiven. Because a lot of times it's hard to be forgiving. And the Sermon on the Mount models an approach to God which frees us from the sense that we need to be the moral enforcers in the world. And even when we're so often wronged, and the more you minister, probably the more you're going to be taken advantage of, here and there, and maybe a lot. Jesus lived with that all the time. And that was part of the glory of his ministry, was he gave it to the Father. And he taught his disciples in the Sermon on the Mount to do the same. I'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you.